Economics Forum, Department of Economics, the St. Joseph's College of Autonomous, presents to you our first offline event of the year in collaboration with B.PAC, the Bangalore Political Action Committee. Today's event is a discussion with Dr. Vikram K Chand, a former senior public sector management specialist at the World Bank, moderated by Mr. K Jairaj, IAS retired secretary to the government of Karnataka, on the topic approach to delivery of public services, putting the people first. Now, a brief introduction on our guest speaker today, Dr. Vikram K Chand. Vikram K Chand is a former senior public sector management specialist at the World Bank in New Delhi, where he has worked on issues relating to public service delivery. He is the author of Mexico's Political Awakening, as well as edited 2 volumes, Reinventing Public Service Delivery in India, Selected Case Studies, and Public Service Delivery in India, Understanding the Reforms Process. It is an honor to have you here with us today, sir. The discussion will also be moderated by Sir K Jairaj. Sir K Jairaj is a member of the 1976 Indian Administrative Service, IAS, and is retired as the Additional Chief Secretary to the Government of Karnataka. He has held distinguished posts in infrastructure, energy, transportation, and urban development sectors, including Additional Chief Secretary of the Energy Department, Chairman of BESCOM, Bangalore International Airport Limited, Karnataka Power Corporation Limited, and Bangalore City Corporation, BMP, for 2 terms, Commissioner for Commercial Taxes, and Principal Secretary to the Chief Minister. Dr. Vikram, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Jairaj. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah. You want to come up so that we don't have to shout, please? I know that there is a tendency to always sit at the back, but it's good. Please, you can have a cozier gathering. Okay, so I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Vikram Chand, my dear friend and esteemed colleague, who was in the World Bank for many years and who is a governance expert. Vikram happened to be in Bangalore, and B.PAC has scheduled this conference. And so what we will do, if it's okay with all of you, is it's now 4:10. So we will request Vikram to speak for about 35-40 minutes. Or yeah, just make a few comments. And then after that, maybe 20-25 minutes. Then I will have some questions for you. And then I'd like to throw it open to our young friends across, because let's make this an interactive session, okay? So listen to what he is saying carefully and then feel free to react. So you know, the title of the subject is Approach to Delivery of Public Services, Putting People First. All of us here in this room, whatever we are doing, are familiar with what public services are. You are being consumers of public services one way or the other, right? And in the context of public services, that is what the government extends to the citizens, there are 5 or 6 dimensions that are very important and which I am sure Vikram will address. First is the quality of public service. Okay? The services that the government gives the citizens, how good is it? Do the citizens benefit from it, or is it just a kind of makeshift arrangement that is done? For instance, you know, you study in a premier college premier university in Bangalore, okay? I was a student of this college many years ago, and then as now, this institution is actually exemplary. But many people are not as fortunate as you to have studied here or studied in similar institutions. And you know the state of primary education in our country, especially that in the public domain, is so poor. So the quality of public services of that kind, for instance, or in a government hospital, leave much to be desired. So that is the first dimension of public service, quality. The second dimension is quantity. By quantity I mean, how much does the government spend in terms of essential public services like health, education, welfare, provisioning of law and order and so on. And the standard argument is that compared to other countries like China, India spends very little, almost half of what they do in relation to our GNP. And even within India, the state of Kerala is the outlier because what it does in terms of this kind of public services is much more than, let us say, Bihar or UP. So that is regarding the quantity. By quantity I mean the provisioning of funds for public services. The third aspect of public service is effectiveness. You know, all governments say they work for the people, right? But actually, what happens in practice? You are all too young, so you may not have interacted with the government. But try getting a birth certificate. Try getting a death certificate. Not for yourself, of course, some others. Try getting a land record. Try getting a registration document. Try getting a khata. And you understand what the travails and difficulties are in terms of provisioning of public services. That's what I mean by saying delivery of public services. It's full of corruption, it is full of delay, and it is full of difficulties for the ordinary public. The next dimension of public service, apart from all what I have mentioned, is the effectiveness of service delivery. How good is the government in preparing itself and delivering the service? In other words, what is the project management capability of the government? What we call as execution excellence. Very important. And why is the execution of public service deficient? Two other aspects and then I will hand it over to Vikram. One is, what is the role of public representatives in service delivery, in provisioning of service? I mean the elected representatives. And how much are they proactive in this regard? And finally, what is the role of the bureaucracy, the administration, in ensuring proper public services? So maybe Vikram, on the basis of his wide experience, can draw upon these examples of good provisioning of public service, best practices, which states according to him are doing well, which are not doing well, how we can improve, and what is the role of the citizen in putting pressure on the government for effective public services. So these are, all the dimensions that I thought of on the basis of my work experience in government. And now I promise that Vikram will have at least 20-25 minutes after my 5 minutes introduction. So now, over to Vikram. Again, to repeat, Vikram, I have requested Vikram to speak for about 20-25 minutes, touching on whatever I have asked, but even otherwise on the basis of his wide experience. And then we will have back and forth discussions with the audience as also the questions from my side. Okay, Vikram?
Thank you.
The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Does anyone know how to manipulate this speech?
I'm going to sit there. Too cold.
Yeah, let me just, turn this on. Okay. Good. All right. Well, certainly, all of you are what, economics students, or what stream are you guys from?
For a minute to sit and talk.
Wants me to sit and talk because I can't see my presentation if I do that. So
So
Yeah.
you do photogenic sitting.
All right. Take a picture. Thank you. Okay, great, excellent. Yeah. So how many? I'm just trying to get a sense of the background. World Economics is a giant in administration and service delivery, and obviously in very pithy fashion, he summed up all of the challenges: quality, quantity, bureaucracy, political ownership, execution, project management. I mean, and financing, of course. So from that, you get a sense of how vast the field is, and and the agony that people have when parents pass on and you have to get a death certificate, or you have a child and you have to get a birth certificate. I must say that when my son was born several years ago, I had a very easy time because they had networked the hospital to the Delhi Municipal Corporation, and a few days later, I went in, and they just spun out the birth certificate. It was all of 5 minutes, and I took 20 copies because I never wanted to sort of go back there for the rest of my life. And those 20 copies are sitting in my almirah, gathering dust. I had to use a couple of those certificates when we had to get them in school and things like that. So we had a very easy time. And that's because of networking, e-governance. I didn't have to pay a fee. So there's been quite a fee above the fee. So there's been quite a lot of change. And of course in Bangalore you have initiatives like Sakala and things like that that are trying to improve service delivery. But look, I can talk about the right to public services, birth certificates, katas, registration, and I will do that. But since you guys are economics students, let me start off with a sense of what the larger framework of the economy is in India, and what that, the challenges that arise from that framework. So let's just go to the first slide, and I'll be very quick here. I admit this is an overwhelming slide, but what you see from this slide is that our population is disproportionately concentrated in terms of the workforce in agriculture, about 43%, services, which is about 35% of employment, 32% in 2020, but it was higher in 2018, and manufacturing is 25% of employment. Tragically, GDP in agriculture is just 18%. So 44% of the population has to live off 18% of GDP. So right there you have a problem. Right there you have a huge set of issues. Then you have the service sector, which sounds fancy in Bangalore because you have all these IT companies and all that. I think that's services, banking, insurance, the modern sector. But the service sector also includes Kelawalas, it also includes petty retail, it also includes domestic services performed by domestic help. So there's a whole range of stuff. The work of women in households, although not monetized as an element of GDP, but it's still very much a service. And you see that GDP is about, from the service sector, is about 49%, 32% of employment. These employment figures are, of course, understated because it's very difficult to track self-employed people or businesses that consist of just one or two persons, and they sort of fall under the radar. Now, employment is such that, for most Indians, it's migrant labor, it's work in the household, it's construction, it's petty retail, and it's MNREGA. Now, that's the dismal picture that you face. And the thing is, I say it's dismal because India's had a hard time industrializing in a way that is labor intensive. And since the Second World War, the only way to do that has been to promote export-oriented industrialization, which is what the Japanese did in the 50s, Taiwan and Korea subsequently, and China after 1979, with the introduction of the household responsibility system that effectively gave control to peasants of their own land, furnishing them incentives to produce food for the industrial sector, and a change in foreign investment policy driven by Taiwan and Japan. I mean, the Chinese looked at Japan and they looked at Taiwan, they saw the huge technological gap, and they said, my gosh, we better do something about this. And so foreign investment began to flow in, technology began to flow in, Deng Xiaoping had different ideas. And so they took off, and they built a strategic relationship with America that was positive for many, many years. It's now turning sour. And so in that sense, the Americans wanted to build up China as they had Japan, as a counterweight to the Russians. And China, for a very long period of time, was very heavily dependent on the US export market, on foreign investment and things like that. India, and so obviously the share of rural agriculture in GDP and employment in agriculture has come down substantially, but not so in India. And this then leads to a bunch of problems, which I'll come to here at the bottom of the slide. One, this is not a rich economy, even though it seems to be growing fast. It's the modern sector that's growing fast. The rural sector is also growing pretty fast, depending on the numbers that you use, but from a low base. So you don't have lots of revenue that can be generated to finance service delivery, especially when there's a contraction. Second, because per capita income is low, we talk a lot about GDP in an aggregate sense. India has a large GDP, we're a big player, we're important now because of our GDP, but actually just divide that by the denominator, population. And we have we're just a low middle income country, barely, 2,000 plus dollars of per capita income, not in PPP terms, of course, just real per capita, actual per capita income, and which is pretty bad, compared to China and some other countries. So that means there may be a lot of people who depend on services, especially social safety nets, and that's where universalization of PDS comes in. That's where Manrega comes in, and there's a lot of dependence on these services. And because you're living fairly close to subsistence levels in some ways, you're hovering around. I hesitate to use the word poverty line because they're different poverty lines. But what you would reasonably expect to be a decent standard of living, most people are very, very close to that line, and they can easily be pushed down. And that's for the majority of Indians. So this is still a very poor country with a large modern sector, dualistic economy in character, and so services have to sort of follow that basic structure. So it doesn't generate enough finance to promote widespread service delivery. You'd expect more people to depend on social safety nets, and social safety nets have to be provided for two reasons. One, you want a politically stable country, and two, there are questions of human dignity involved, and this idea that fundamentally we are all equal in a very fundamental sense, and there is no question of allowing large swaths of the population to live in miserable conditions for an extended period of time. But that's precisely what we've done, actually. We've turned our blind eye to immense militarization in India. Even with the poverty line coming down, it's still a very poor country. And let's face that. Instead of saying, no, we have the biggest GDP, we have big GDP, and it's growing fast, and we're going to be one of the largest economies in the world, and we're so great, blah, blah, blah. Let's take a critical eye and be very clear about what the problems are and sort them out. There are technical solutions, there are political solutions, there are a bunch of other solutions. Now, one solution is, of course, boosting economic growth, but it's not going to be enough to boost Bangalore's economic growth, or Mumbai's economic growth, or Delhi's economic growth. We need to have inclusive growth, and that means promoting medium enterprises. That means developing labor-intensive industries that can export, textiles, for instance, and that means a strategic perspective over a long period of time to maximize employment in the Indian economy. No employment, more dependence on the state and its social services, and more living close to the subsistence line and hovering around that line. And then when COVID comes, you get pushed below, and the government of India, the bureaucracy says, lockdown, and suddenly people read Barca dance book on this, it's worth a read. And you see the misery, the wholesale misery that comes tumbling out of the closet. Because we do our best to put all this in the closet, the unseen poor, and don't want to be reminded of them. The majority, this is your country, and you have to do something about it. So, the state governments, the central government, there is a revenue problem, especially at the state level. You have a hemorrhaging power sector. You have political management of power. You have large debt obligations, problems of inflexible revenue expenditure, whether it's interest, salaries, pensions. Not a whole lot of fiscal space. It's although if you read Aditi Nair's piece, in the Indian Express the other day, she says, well, this year there's a bit more space, but that's just a relative point for a given fiscal year. The overall situation is that fiscal space is limited, it's constrained. So unless you expand the pie, you're not going to be able to generate the kind of fiscal resources to finance service delivery. And if it's inclusive, then more people have incomes that they can rely on, therefore they don't need your services. They don't need free food, they don't need Manrega. So you want growth to finance service delivery, and you want inclusive growth to reduce dependence on services. Both of those things are necessary. So that's on the economic side. Now, there's a long debate about this. Our service is underfunded. The crumbling PHC, the abandoned district hospital that took 10 years to build because of cost overruns and time overruns. The operating theatre that's filthy. You might contract a deadly disease if you walk into the operating theatre and happen to be the unfortunate one to be treated there. Is this a problem of government, or is this a problem of financing of services? In health, Indians as a whole, the whole country spends about a fair amount on health. It's about 3%. But this is not government expenditure. This is just expenditure on health goods and services. And a lot of this is out-of-pocket expenditure by ordinary citizens. They spend out of their own pocket. There's no insurance, or insurance is out of reach. And the insurance companies, many of them are quite mercenary. And they want your premiums, but they don't necessarily want to pay without lots of bureaucratic hurdles. And they're not always held to account for that. Compared to, say, 5.5% in China, Brazil is almost 10%, Russia 5.6%. We're about the same as Indonesia in terms of the health spend by the economy as a whole. But then if you look at spending by domestic general government, let me just ask a question. What is domestic general government? Definition of domestic general government. National accounts. This is central and state expenditures on health. General means central and state. You probably should know this, but anyway. Maybe you haven't gotten into national accounts yet. But this is about 1% before the pandemic. And then with a bit of jugglery, vaccine stocks and things like that, it seems to have gone up a little bit. Modi ji has announced medical colleges in every district, that kind of thing. But for years you've been spending about 1% on healthcare. And obviously it's no surprise that it looks so wretched, the panorama of health. And this 1% compares to 3% in China. So we spend a third in China. 3% in Russia, 4% in Brazil. Indonesia is about where we are. So, now when we get to education, this is general government. 3.45% of GDP, that's a bit better. So let me test your knowledge. The National Economic Policy specifies a target of spending by general government of what? Who wants to hazard a guess? You want to hazard a guess? Yes? Anyone wants to hazard a guess? 6%. You all must read the National Education Policy because it will affect you. It will have some impact. So they want to go up to 6%, and that's great. So I personally think there is a funding issue, there's a financing issue here. And the two big initiatives in service delivery in recent years, PDS and Manrega, this idea of a National Food Security Act and a National Employment Guarantee Scheme Act that the National Advisory Council promoted, which the BJP then inherited and owned eventually. This was partly because of the fast growth in the 2000s. They were able to finance it. But the growth was not inclusive, so you have a lot of people who are dependent then on these services because they're not participating in this growth boom. The Sensex is participating in this boom. And the Sensex basically is I think it's essentially a gambling, a place for gambling. It's driven up and down by foreign portfolio investors, and the newspapers sickening cheers about the market going up and tears when it comes down. And frankly, I'm very skeptical. I don't think this. I think that obviously you need an efficient vehicle to finance savings, and that's all I'm willing to give to the Sensex. It's a savings mobilization instrument for investment. But that's about it. It has nothing to do with the economy. Don't cry when it goes down, and don't cheer when it goes up. It's got nothing to do with the real economy, as far as I'm concerned. It has everything to do with an oligopolistic economic structure that has rent-seeking embedded into it in the private sector as well as the public sector. The private sector is as rapacious as the public, maybe more so, and is as complicit in rent-seeking as the public sector, maybe more so. There are no good guys or bad guys. They're all in the same boat together. So, the question then is it governance or is it spending? And maybe this is a bit wishy-washy because I don't really know the answer. I think it's both. You have to do both. You have to hike spending and you have to improve institutional settings so that you improve what Jairaj called the quality of spending, the quality of execution, the result on the ground. Jairaj is one of our most senior, most effective civil servants, and he's seen this, close up. And I think Jairaj himself would agree that it's a financing problem, but it is also an institutional governance problem. Correct, Jairaj?
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's move on a bit. You can interrupt me if you have any questions. I promise not to test your knowledge. Let's look at this. Now, the flavor of the month, and we've got Mission Karmyogi, named after this notion of the Karma Yogi, working out, good in the world as almost sort of mega heroic notion of transformation, the yogi transforming the world. And that's, how many of you know what Mission Karma Yogi is? Mission Karma Yogi at the back. How many people know what Mission Karma Yogi is? Jairaj, can you tell them what Mission Karma Yogi is?
You tell them.
Okay. It's a program announced by Government of India to improve the quality of civil service. Basically. And it's been unveiled with great fanfare. And I'll come to this because it has direct implications for all this, and it's a great initiative. Believe me, I think it's a good initiative. Karma Yogi mission is very important. However, basically it responds to this notion that the Indian state has lost or lacks capacity to implement basic programs effectively. I don't think that's entirely true. I think they've done a good job in BDS. I think they've done a good job in Manrega. I think many of the Right to Public Services Acts have done a great job in improving the situation for access to land records and paper services. But certainly there is a problem in terms of health and education. Now, in health, we're falling behind Bangladesh and many advanced economies, and certainly all the other BRIC countries in terms of infant mortality, maternal mortality, basic immunization rates. Stunting rates, 35% of all children under 5 are stunted. How many of you know what it means to be stunted? Yeah?
When the growth in height is reduced, it doesn't, it stops at a certain level.
That's right. For age, your height is too low. 35% of your children are stunted in the year 2021. Awful, isn't it? Okay, 36% wasted. Okay, who wants to tell me what wasted is? How many of you have thought about wasted children? Raise your hands if you've thought about the problem.
Yeah, below the height and weight the average child should weigh when they are born.
The weight primarily, not even when they're born, and for the age. And so most of, a third of our children are either too short or lack the appropriate weight for their age. Now, I mean, and we have, Mrs. Indira Gandhi announced the ICDS scheme in the 70s. How many of you know what ICDS is? What does it stand for? Integrated Child Development Program. And obviously, this hasn't worked. If you call it by any name you want, the figures still stare at you in the face. So, there are other problems. We focus on curative health, we don't focus on preventive, we don't have a public health cadre. There's a great report that Joseph Bore, a civil servant from the British Raj, penned in the 40s and setting the tone for the health sector. And some of his recommendations were accepted, some weren't. And we rely a lot on insurance to gain access to treatment, and on the private sector for the rich and fancy, i.e. middle class, upper middle class, Bangaloreans or Delhiites or things like that. These are the rich and fancy who populate the rich and fancy hospitals like Max and all of these places, Medanta and things like that. Now, on the other hand, I've been to villages in Jharkhand where I've looked to find the sub-center, and the sub-center is a dark blackened room with a steel door with a lock on it, and you peer into the room and all you see is just a dank empty space. Granted, it's anecdotal. Look at the Comptroller and Auditor General's report on Jharkhand, just Google it. And you'll find that they've taken years to complete district hospitals. They don't have staff, adequate staff. Construction is of poor quality. Centralized procurement somehow has not worked because they haven't financed it, so it's been decentralized to the district levels, which means you can't compete for procurement of medicines. And doctors don't show up to treat. They're too busy doing other things. So this is, obviously, it's no wonder that you have this stunting, wasting problem, and so on. And, you have this whole transfer racket, where politicians are paid to transfer staff around, and money changes hands, and it's a very rickety health system. Now, you might say, look, if I hike the allocation from 1% to say 3 or 4%, then everybody will get involved and say we want accountability, because you're spending more. You're spending so little that this has just been, this is a kind of patronage that politicians, employees, doctors, and others have just captured the service. And citizens have been pushed out. And most Indians cannot afford to go to Medanta. In fact, they'll be kicked out. They won't even be allowed to enter the hospital. So we're living in a kind of dark age when it comes to health in this country, and COVID has shaken it up. But I wonder really whether we just get back to our usual ways, despite the horrors of COVID, where we saw exactly what the health system is capable of and what it wasn't capable of. Capable of in terms of the kind of incompetence that it displayed in the wake of this sort of rush for treatment. Okay. Now there are some success stories, limited success stories within the context of the state that overall hasn't done too well on health. Himachal, Kerala, TN have not done so badly. I think there you see in TN a kind of bipartisan consensus to have good social services. So PDS is better than any other state. Health, education tends to be pretty good. And all services tend to be pretty good. It's not service specific. It has something to do with the contribution of the state to this. Maybe it has something to do with the self-respect movement. Maybe it has something to do with the level of social mobilization. Maybe the bureaucracy has a higher competence level. And then there are debates about these questions. I'm just posing them, I'm not going to answer them. Himachal Pradesh is also a great success story, especially in education. Lots of community participation, lots of political ownership, and despite being mountainous, which means it's more difficult to locate people, to actually keep PHCs functioning and monitor. Government has done a good job, and Himachal's HDI index, the development index, is very good. It's right up there with TN and some of the other states that are doing well in the HDI index. How many of you know what the HDI index is? Human Development Index, yeah. Okay, good, great. So, and in Canada, of course, you have a highly participatory society. I mean, the temporal entry movement, going back to the 30s, I think is a sign of protest against institutionalized social discrimination. And the Maharajas of Travancore, Cochin were all fairly progressive. I mean, they put in, education systems for the people that the British had not put into in their areas. The British were laggards. They were far behind. They left us, a country that was mired in poverty and illiteracy when they finally left in 1947. And so, we had done pretty well given where we started. But then if you horizontalize the comparison to other countries, we've not done particularly well. So it's a complex dilemma. And Himachal also has more egalitarian social norms. And I think that also leads to a greater identification. I mean, there is this sense of us and them, the poor versus the rest. And there is a kind of cultural, social discrimination against the poor, which goes beyond the fact of being poor. And I think we have to unpack that. There is also this phenomenon of, many years ago, I hesitate to say this, but many years ago, Edward Banfield wrote a book on Sicily in the late 50s, and he said, in Sicily, what I saw was amoral familism. And amoral familism, he said, was, people look out for themselves and their families. They're not bothered about the rest of the social order. So, in a sense, we seem to be confined to our own circles, our own families, our own people, ourselves. We don't really think about the larger social question. We're very mired in our own little identities. And actually want us to jump out from that and jump into this terrain and really start to redeem it and fix it. I think that's the problem. There's a certain institutionalized blindness to the pain of others in the Indian structure, which may be rooted in a long history of social fragmentation and institutionalized cultural discrimination. Okay, state capacity in education. This is very interesting. How many of you know about the work of Karthik Muralidhar, who's in the economics department that teaches in the US? And but he's been very active here. He's working with several institutions in India. He's done a review of all the randomized controlled trials that have been conducted on education. How many of you are familiar with RCTs? The concept of RCTs? Treatment groups, control groups, that kind of thing. Okay, let's just say it's it's a statistical technique basically to see, if in a given group you try a given reform out and you don't try it in the other group and you control for other factors, what's the result? So you can test it out. Some hospitals introduce biometric attendance. Basically, the constraints in education seem to emerge partly from pedagogy. There are there's a whole generation of first-time learners, and they all come into schools without, at different points in their learning foundation. So you can't treat them equally in a classroom. So the idea then is, well, do we, this is what Pratham talks about. Do we use streaming? Do we teach at the right level? Computer learning techniques like MindSpark. I found my MindSpark quite useful for training in maths and things like that if you're a youngster. And the Delhi government has introduced this streaming, but they had to do it outside the classroom context, as far as I know, because it's difficult to do it inside the classroom. So there is some commitment required by teachers, extra commitment. And so there's a whole issue of pedagogy, calibrating the delivery of education to students based on their level. And the issue here is quality. I mean, the point is, Pratham, which publishes the annual survey of education in India, has shown the quality gap in terms of numeracy and literacy. How many of you are aware of the work of Pratham? Okay. So this is all policy stuff. This is the stuff you should be doing after you got your BA in economics. But I guess, any case, there's a huge quality issue. Now, what are the government's challenges? Motivating teachers to perform. Now, the argument here is that teachers are at the bottom of the pyramid. There's this huge bureaucratic superstructure about them. And as a result, teachers feel demotivated. It's a culture, a circular culture, as one of her pieces, Yamini Iyer, points out. And government, they're bombarded with circulars, they get demoralized. And so, they end up not teaching. And there are high absenteeism rates in our schools. So, even in a country like Mexico, where I worked for several years, and they have a powerful teachers' union, despite that, teachers do turn up to teach, as far as I know. But in this country, there are absenteeism rates that are quite high, 25% to 40%. It's crazy. People just not turning up. What's going on here? You are a government teacher. You're paid more than the average private teacher to teach. But no, not only will you be paid more, but you won't even turn up to teach. I mean, come on. What self-respect do you have for yourself? Performance-based pay, there's a study in Rajasthan, an RCT, which Karthik, these are not studies by Karthik, he's just summarizing them, where they actually paid teachers to come, over and above what they were being paid. And they were able to bring the absenteeism rate down pretty fast. This whole question of lifetime employment as a regular teacher versus contractual, the data seems to show that they are both equally effective in terms of learning quality, or ineffective in terms of learning quality. But contractual teachers cost less, and they are absent less. But we have a scramble to become a regular teacher. So whenever you hire contractual teachers, they all demand a regularization at some point. But this is a huge fiscal problem for the government. Yeah. Community control, village councils and community control, improved HR management, this whole recruitment, transfer and promotions question. There's a lot of corruption in recruitment, and private sector engagement. It's not very clear that the voucher system has worked well in India. So I better move a little faster. Under this issue of human capital, this is a human capital index. How is the education and health system equip you to maximize your life possibilities? And countries are ranked. Now, India is ranked 117 out of 173 countries, around 0.49%. China is at 0.65. So, if you were told, and you knew nothing else, let's think of Rawls's veil of ignorance, you absolutely knew nothing except that you knew that, you could be born in either India or China, and you had this HCI data, you probably picked China as a place to be born because you had better life possibilities. So all this points to a massive wastage of human potential. That's what it points to. We're wasting human potential on a grand scale. And this goes back to Sen's point about the state's duty to maximize the potential of citizens to realize themselves in development. Okay, now last point. I'm going to just talk very briefly about technology because Jairaj talked about some of these land services, birth certificates, death certificates. Technology has played a big role in improving service delivery, no question about that. By digitizing beneficiary lists, using Aadhaar to verify those lists so you can cut corruption, smart cards to promote access, GPS tracking for food from the FCI go down right to the fair price shop, websites where you can track the stock position, and things have improved in PDS. I mean, today I think it's what, 70% of the poor depend on PDS for themselves, and the leakage rate has come down. The leakage rate is captured by an indicator which is called the purchase entitlement rate. Based on your entitlement, how much do you purchase? And that's consistently gone up. So there's been considerable improvement in PDS, considerable improvement in and now of course they're going to this idea of one nation, one ration card. So that means you will be able to introduce an element of portability, or you go from one PDF shop to another in a different state. They all have a common list, and you could draw on your ration almost anywhere. This is very important for the 100 million or so rural migrants who move from city to city in search of employment. And MREGA and PDS together got us through the COVID crisis. And technology played a big role. Now in MREGA, e-job cards, electronic muster rolls, direct transfers into bank accounts, Aadhaar verified. This has helped considerably. Of course, there are criticisms that this is too technologically driven, and what's happening is that people are being excluded. And my answer to that is we need to also show responsiveness and introduce an override principle. When say somebody turns up without an Aadhaar card and wants his or her ration, they should be given that. I won't say more about that. Now, the real issue though, in my view, is transforming processes. We've been very good at drafting technology onto a treaty system, but we have been less willing to reform processes or institutional structures. Now, this whole question is interesting because every service that you have in this country, whether it's birth certificates, whether it's death certificates, whether it's land records, whether it's filing an FIR, goes back to a legal structure. And many of these rules have, they've been amended in an ad hoc way. An amendment is passed, a change occurs, but many of these basic rules go back to the British period. So the Telegraph Act, right? I'm always amused by the 1880, I think it's 1880, Telegraph Act, still presiding over this dynamic economy with high rates of internet penetration. Well, they updated it through amendments. And of course, these laws, in Parliament, they spend 10 minutes on a law. So Parliament is not adding value in terms of improving the quality of law. So we haven't done enough to reform our legal processes, which then undergird our legal rules for services, which then undergird the processes. We've drafted technology onto a treaty system, resistance to change. Verification is a huge problem. So I might put income certificates online. You apply online, you get your certificate online. Somebody still has to go and visit your home to check and see what your income is, and that's where corruption happens. I might put land records online, but the village accountant still has to verify that you in fact own that piece of land. That's where corruption happens. And we are unable to prevent this capture of services by government servants who have to verify these kinds of things. And I was very shocked to learn from a senior bureaucrat in Bihar that the block development officer, 70 to 80% turnover rates in terms of transfers a year, and a very, very active marketing posts. This is circa 2010 or 12. And why? Because BDOs control the flow of schemes. and scheme money. So that's another issue. We haven't been able to tackle this whole issue. And this whole, look at the number of steps to get a pension, at first at the block level, then it goes through the same steps at the subdivisional level. At the end, the system spits out a sanction letter, not even the pension, the sanction letter. And you take that sanction letter to get the actual pension in your bank account. You don't know whether you have to pay off someone so that the money is actually transferred. So there's a huge problem, and it's poor liquidity dependence. Okay, Jairaj, I want to now wrap up. Responsive government. Now, coming back to Mission Karmayogi, the idea is to create a responsive government. They're hoping to come at it from a training angle, but my view is they would have to address some fundamental issues. Interference with bureaucracy by politicians at all levels of the system, frequent transfers, I need to cut patronage, protect performance, disrupt the market in posts, say in the registration department, market in posts, etc., so you can skim off money from property transactions and land transactions, bring in people from outside into the system, a more effective performance management approach, more autonomy for key institutions, including service delivery institutions. Now, and making district administration more coherent. At the district levels, we have PRIs, we have Zilla Parishads, we have Gram Panchayats, we have DRDAs, we have line departments, we have schemes, we have the collector sitting on top of this highly complicated institutional ecology, and it doesn't quite work. And our government has done the right thing creating this aspirational districts program. Let's see where that goes. Now, I end with just a few brief comments about a country where, and Jairaj, with your forbearance, this last slide, where we do have responsive government. Singapore. Now, although it's a small city-state, they have very aggressive performance management institutions in the Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister's office. Their KPIs, key performance indicators, are very cleverly designed, few in number. And I remember meeting Naidu's government many years ago, and he had, performance measures running into the hundreds. Singapore's experience is that you want very few measures. You want to hold people to account for that. You want to review those measures every 3 to 5 years, and you may not necessarily want to tie that to budgets. For various reasons, because KPIs are not just a function of will. There are many things that can go off a KPI. And REACH is an electronic platform, so that high-level citizens, high-level officials can communicate with citizens electronically and physically. And so that's how they get their message across. Then they have this, what's called GovTech, which is trying to digitize service delivery across services in a major way. And one of their KPIs is, that for any project that has cross-cutting implications, cuts across departments, all information will be provided electronically within 7 days. But the broader structure of this is a Confucian state. And as you know, those of you who've read Confucius, you have a duty to perform. You have a duty to satisfy the needs of citizens. And if citizens are not satisfied, or their needs are not satisfied, they have the right to overthrow their government. So this is a Confucian state, gaining legitimacy through responsive government, effective service delivery, and tight communication. And we need to think a lot about the Singapore model, because this idea of rulers governing according to a kind of dharmic principle for the good of citizens is really important, because as we see in the final slide, it's not clear that our politicians do that. As a former Prime Minister of India once told me, when I had the privilege of meeting him, and I won't mention his name, you can guess it, he said, our politicians are all short-run maximizers. What does that tell you? What are they maximizing? Access to power and resources. Now that's not what he said. He said they're just short-run maximizers. I added the words maximizing power and resources. If that's what it's all about, I'm sorry, you're getting nowhere, because you don't have a vision. You're not trying to fix real problems. You're simply trying to hang on to power for the sake of power. And that to me is a huge, huge problem. Active civil society, we really need to nurture civil society because citizens may not have the time to participate. If I'm a relatively poor citizen, I have to go to work. I can't sit there and monitor a roads project. So I need CSOs to do that, groups like B.PAC. Jairaj is doing a fantastic job and his group in bringing in civic leaders to incubate change at the grassroots level. And I think this is terrific work being done by B.PAC. But we constrain our CSOs. The regulatory framework is a punishing framework for civil society organizations. Yeah, okay. So last point, and I will close with this, we need to provide space for governmental action. And this means more autonomy in a federal compact, in fiscal and administrative terms, real cooperative federalism, and decentralization to ULBs. Now in Bangalore, why can't we have a 5-year term for men? That's an interesting question. Or Delhi, why is it just 1 year? These are questions that need to be thought of. And schemes could be turned into block grants, which are more flexible in nature and give more autonomy. And you can just set standards. So to sum up, the rise of India in the world is tied not just to military power or GDP. It depends on a healthy, well-educated, productive citizen. That's the real measure of progress. So let's get real here and focus on these more immediate challenges. So thanks, Jairaj. Sorry for testing your patience.
So let's give Vikram a big hand, please. It was a very substantive discussion, and I'm sure all of you. So you have answered the delivery of public services, why it is so poor. So let's begin by asking you, any one of you, those who said they were not satisfied with either the BBMP or the government, can you tell us briefly why you are not satisfied so that Vikram can answer that question? Anybody? Please? Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Okay, so I don't
Loudly.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
I don't really understand to blame the corporator of the area or the BBMP for not having a proper coordination and the cleanliness in the area, like even after complaining many times.
Right.
So yeah.
Even after complaining many times. Not responsive to the requirements of the people. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Loudly. Yeah, one sec. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. We as a society are a welfare state, right, sir? So as people, we all have certain expectations, certain wants, and when we set those expectations and wants, and it's undermet, it doesn't meet.
Okay, got it. Expectations not met. There at the back, please. Loudly.
So I guess, to be honest, I think this kind of lack of transparency, I can say.
Lack of transparency.
Yes.
So here are these 3 issues that Vikram will answer. Hang on, Vikram, just make a note. One is responsiveness, the other is expectations not fulfilled, and the third is transparency. 3 major issues. Yeah, 4.
Sir, lack of coordination among various departments. PWD will delegate and again the people come.
Okay, let's pose it to Vikram as to how public service provisioning and delivery by the government can take care of these 4 issues which are gaps. Vikram? Mike.
That's a very broad question, Jairaj. Could you phrase it a little bit more?
So tell us from your examples in, say, Kerala or Himachal Pradesh, how those governments have provided for better quality public service. Or for that matter, Delhi. Just give us some quick examples.
Well, I mean, thanks, Jairaj. Look, I think on public services, I was coming back to Karnataka, and then I'll get into Himachal. When I worked here in the early 2000s with the World Bank, we doing a project, large project. We were very encouraged with the Bangalore Gender Task Force, the BCC, transparency in tenders, procurement act, right to information, fund-based accounting, accrual-based accounting. All the reforms were in place. The CM seemed to be moving in the right direction. Reformist bureaucrats like Jairaj were running the show. And really, I mean, I thought things were aligned. And then I saw, you know, looking back, I see many of the same issues are still there, unresolved. Things have not really gone the way we expected. And so you're left to wonder why. It's not the bureaucracy. I think there's some excellent civil servants around. It has to be that it has to relate to the focus of the political leadership. What are their priorities? Are they willing to put pressure for change? And that, I think, is true of both Himachal and Kerala. And it has to do with the lower bureaucracy. Are they co-opted? Are they captured? What is their relationship with the politician, the local politician? What about all these interests that cluster around services, the village accountants, the notaries, those cadres that are directly involved in delivering a service? What are they up to? We did a survey of Sakala in Karnataka, and we found that for, you know, if you paid, for every 1,000 rupees you paid to a government official who came to verify your service, say a village accountant coming to verify your land record details or that kind of thing, your chances of getting the certificate in time doubled per 1,000 rupees paid over and above the actual fee for the service. So this is still encrusted in the system, and I was dismayed to learn the other day from the newspapers that that procurement remains a real problem in terms of you know, where you have leaders that are very closely linked to the community, and where the pressure by politicians, all strikes, has been to actually improve health, education, and social indicators, and even promote industrialization in the lower plains. And we notice that many of the pharmaceutical companies have operations in Himachal. I think that the answer lies in politics. I think the bureaucrats, the senior ones, some of them are quite good. I mean, internationally competitive. Jairaj could be an international civil servant in any part of the world and perform well. But he might not perform as well in a department where there are entrenched interests operating against citizens. Then the other angle is the work you're doing on civic information. There needs to be relentless pressure. But the problem is that, you know, not all of us have the time to pressure the system. You know.
So to answer that lady's point, you know, I'll ask Sharat some other time to talk about B.CLIP. How we are trying to see that local leadership, I think you asked that question, how local leadership can be responsive to the needs of the people, what Vikram said. So maybe you can please talk of B.CLIP some other time, have an exposure to these people, because that's really important. Okay, second poll. And then Vikram will respond, because I have a question on that poll. How many of you think that there is a lot of corruption in the system? Put up your hands if you think so. Right. So now my question to Vikram is, evidently there is so much of corruption in the system.
Yeah.
Are there any legal measures that can be taken in the context of delivery of public services by which this corruption can be reduced?
Thank you, Jairaj. That's a terrific question. I will come at that in different ways. I mean, one of you mentioned a grievance redress and nobody responded. You might have a fancy portal and you might alert a government servant to that, but if they don't respond, it's useless. And corruption is widespread. The TI index, India has not improved substantially because of the problem with electoral bonds. I think our rating has in fact gone down a little bit. And after 20 years of working on these issues in the World Bank and watching these issues for more than 20 years, I must say, the progress on this front has been pretty limited. And, you know, I'm not very hopeful about legal remedies for many reasons. One is the court system is jammed. with cases. So I don't see that
Okay.
necessarily happening. And then this whole question of lokayuktas. It's always questionable whether the lokayukt was an effective vehicle. But Ramakrishna Hegde's creation of lokayukt in Karnataka, with sanction to prosecute and its own independent investigative force, I believe that has now been overturned.
Perfect. Vikram, let's pose the question to our audience.
Yeah,
If you were given an opportunity,
let's do that. Yeah.
okay, what would you do to control corruption? Anybody? Go ahead, it's okay. Even if you are speculating, put up your hand and tell me, what can we do? Thank God. Yes, you. I'll come to you. Yeah.
The first
Loudly.
The first thing we have to do is educate people. It is the people who are corrupting this system, because people need their work to get done faster, so they will corrupt. So we have to
Corruption,
educate the people.
education of people. But Vikram also just said that provisioning of amount for public education is so low in India. Yes, this lady, young lady, yeah. Loudly, can't hear you.
So I think we should stop giving, certain government officials who sort of involve their services to sort of, work with people in day-to-day life. I think we need to stop, we need to legalize corruption for them, as in they can take money but they'll not be paid salary. So they have an incentive to work, and people also have,
Okay.
at least people will
Now,
know that their work is getting done.
There is a larger issue I want Vikram to talk about in the context of public service. Vikram, speak about accountability of public service, little bit. Accountability.
Yeah.
Briefly.
Not briefly. That again is a huge, broad question.
Right.
But then let me just say there are two ways to come at it. One is internal monitoring. And the system, then holds you to account by performance indicators, audits, things like that. Then there's external monitoring, and I thought, the late Samuel Paul, I think he did fabulous work on report cards and things like that in Bangalore. Hats off to him. In his day, I think he was a great warrior for good government. So citizens and their organizations have to hold government servants to account. Plus the internal monitoring, and then of course there's the external fiduciary environment, the legal structure, and that kind of thing. I don't have a whole lot of faith in that. And I think because we've had so much trouble dealing with the persistence of corruption, we've tried to use technology to get around it, but that doesn't help. For instance, in India, for a minor traffic offense, the policeman may have the right to confiscate your license. Now, if the policeman has a right to confiscate your license and you have to then go back through arduous process to retrieve it, the incentive to engage in a pattern of behavior that would avert that outcome by corruption, it goes up. Otherwise, you might just say, "I'll just pay you the fine." But who's put this rule? So there are bad rules that led to this. There are complicated processes, obdurate bureaucracies, and an inability to deal with it. Because if, say, a senior civil servant like Jairaj cracks down, many of these characters are in cahoots with politicians. And Jairaj might find himself transferred to another post.
Okay, good. All right, another poll. Because this is the best way for us to express our views so that Vikram can respond. How many of you are satisfied with the quality of the people who represent you, either as corporator or as MLA or as MP? Those who are happy with the representatives, please raise your hand. How many of you are dissatisfied? You really think that they're doing a bad job?
Wow.
So, okay, to those of you who have raised your hand, I want to ask you a question before I ask Vikram. What is the reason why you feel that people who represent us are not doing a good job? Anybody would like to answer that? Why are they not doing a good job? Yeah, go ahead. I'll come to you. Go ahead. Quickly.
Because they have their own self-interest. They want to get fulfilled of their self-interest first and then you will do other
Self-interest. Okay. Yes, sir. You?
Yes, sir. So, dominion of power. So, once they come into power, they no longer have the sense of accountability because they already have what they say.
Why? Why?
Because they have what they have come to stand for. So
They are selfish.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other? Yes, please.
Sir, I think I would use a kind of word called domination.
Huh?
Domination.
Domination.
That's what usually politicians they go.
So I'll tell you what is important and why Vikram should answer this. Wherever governments have done well, the quality of government has been good. It is because they have gone by what is called public interest as opposed to private interest. So I would like Vikram, on the basis of his experience, to speak about public interest as against vested interest.
No, I think I think Jairaj, you're absolutely right, and I think the group is right. I mean, you're dissatisfied with the performance of your politicians because politicians have not factored in performance into their objective function, and they seem to be interested in other things, and that might mean retaining power, that might mean getting elected, that might mean meeting obligations to others who helped finance their campaigns. It might mean using the state to pursue personal ends. Having said that, I think there are a lot of politicians who do take public interest into account, and it might be interesting to compare. But certainly at the urban level, there's a lot of petty corruption, and I think that reflects the kind of mafia-like approach to politics. And the question would be, why do these people? How do they get to power? What brings them to power? And why have we chosen to secede from the structure? So most Indian middle class, upper middle class people will not use the health system. They won't send their children to government schools. Everybody has a gen set if power fluctuates. This kind of thing. So there's been a secession from the system. So my sense would be that if we can have a re-engagement with the system, I think you may see better outcomes. Now, I think Delhi is very instructive. I think Kejriwal's government, I think corruption levels are very low. I don't think the party is involved in any kind of corrupt behavior that I can see. And I think they've done a great job improving Delhi schools. And they're attracting children back to those schools. Learning outcomes seem to be improving. Mohalla clinics seem to be reaching out to meet people's basic health needs. There's some issues around subsidies for power and water, but again, I don't think we should have a knee-jerk reaction to subsidies. If you're going to provide free water to slums, there's a strong welfare argument for doing that, and the state has a right to do that if it's on budget. So I'm not too fussed about that. So I think incentives can change, and I think in Delhi there certainly was a desire to deal with this problem, and I think Kejriwal has attempted to address that issue. I think the same thing is true in Himachal, the same thing is true in Kerala, to a lesser degree in Tamil Nadu. So I think it's a mixed picture, Jairaj. So I'll stop there. No.
So, look, we've gone through a gamut of issues. We've spoken about accountability, we've spoken about responsiveness, we've spoken about corruption, we've spoken about delivery of public services. So let me now ask you all a question so that you can respond, and then we'll have Vikram also respond to it. Why does the private sector, and you're all students of economics, right? Why does the private sector always do better than the government. Question, does the private sector do better than the government? If so, why is it that the private sector always is supposed to do better than the government?
So they're better managed.
Can't hear you. You got to put your hand up so that I... Yes, and you got to... Yes, that you spoke first. Go ahead.
In government sector,
Get up. Can't hear you, man.
in government sector there is assurance of job, and even if they doesn't do better, the job is not gone. But in private sector, there is no assurance. Only if we do better, we can stay in the job.
Okay.
I think.
A permanent job. Yes.
The management is better in the private sector, and they use the funds in a more efficient way.
Management is better and they use funds more efficiently. Right? Yes.
I believe private sector is more obsessed with the process, and government does not run with profit based in its mind. So government, some of its schemes might always run in loss because that's not the aim of the government.
Right.
The aim of the government is to provide sector. So it might not like be very hardcore on going after accountability or is it making profit in that particular thing.
Okay. Good. Yes, please.
Sir, I would like to disagree with her point. So, more than profits, I feel the private sector gives a lot of importance to revenue maximization, sales maximization. So, the private sector has targets that you have to achieve, and employees are pressurized to achieve those targets. So, they do better because they want to,
There's a performance oriented.
Yeah, so it's basically performance oriented. That's what I feel.
Right. Anybody else? Yes, please.
Private sector are more adaptable to change and they are more accountable.
Oh, adaptable to change. So how it all relates to what Vikram has said is about whether the institutional framework in government that we have, in whatever form you take it, in terms of people, in terms of objective, in terms of resources, whether this institutional form is permissive or helpful to good provisioning of services for the public, or whether public services must also be privatized. I'd like Vikram to answer this.
Thanks, Jairaj. Look, I sense this group is quite enamored with privatization. And I have a more skeptical view. I think we do need to privatize. I think there are areas where government should not be involved. Why should government run hotels or airports or these kind of things? I think there's a prima facie argument for government getting out of that. And so I would support the standard or Air India, which has been a kind of, it's been draining the government of funds for years. So all of that, certainly, I think there is a profit motive, there is an emphasis on efficiency, there is an emphasis on targets, management might be better, etc., etc. But then on the other hand, if you have a monopoly in the private sector or an oligopoly, would service really be better? So I think the kind of accountability questions that you pose of the state, you also have to pose of the private sector, which is why we have regulators, which is why we have consumer laws, and things like that. So I think certainly there are different areas. Government should be providing public goods that would otherwise not be financed by the private sector. And, we should leave the rest to the private sector.
That's very important, Vikram. Explain to them what public goods are. Let them, please tell them.
Why don't you go ahead and explain? A public good basically is for instance, policing is a pure public good. No private sector group can actually perform the policing function. Although in India we have started to do that, security guards, because we have problems with our own policing function, which is a sign of state failure. So even in the area of public goods that the private sector may not find attractive to invest in, or where they should not be providing services because these are areas that have an impact on the wider social order, there is an element of state failure. There is an element of state failure in policing to some degree. There is an element of state failure in health. There is an element of state failure in education, and that pops up in kids going to private schools, poor kids going to private schools in rural areas. It pops up in non-use of health facilities or the poor performance of public health facilities. It pops up in security. There's a massive security industry in the area of policing, all of that. But I think conceptually that's the argument. But I don't think the private sector should be left to its own devices. Big tech, for instance. Global tech. You're facing Google, you're facing YouTube, you're facing all of these giant companies that have their tentacles all over the world. I mean, frankly, I think they do need to be held to account. And that has to be done by citizens, it has to be done by governments, it has to be done by regulators. And the same thing applies to, the way you regulate the stock market, the way you deal with oligopolies and monopolies. People are people. They will try and maximize rents one way or the other, whether you call a rent a profit or you call a rent corruption. There's an intrinsic attempt to maximize rents across the two systems. So, yes, privatization, maybe in power, distribution companies have helped marginally, but thank God they don't have exclusive control over tariff fixation. Thank God you have a state electricity regulatory commission. Otherwise, we'd all be paying through our noses for power. So no. I mean, don't necessarily, because of state failure, jump into the arms of of the private sector. This ideology of privatization is the solution to all ills. It's not the solution to all ills, because the private sector is not wired to take into account wider public policy problems. The private sector will not clean up your streets. They will not provide security. And the other angle that we need to and this is my last point on this, is the relationship of the private sector to the state, where I think there's a lot of potential for corruption. Licenses, markets, contracts. What is that relationship between heavyweights in the private sector and the state? Financing of political campaigns through various instruments, including electoral bonds. Is the private sector that clean? Is the private sector that high-minded? I'll stop there.
Good. So, I think today, in roughly in an hour and a half, roughly, maybe an hour and 20 minutes, look at the gamut of subjects we've covered. From provisioning of public services, the role of the state, how the state performs, what is the comparative position of other states, why is there so much dissatisfaction in our country, what is the meaning of accountability, why does corruption arise in the system, what is the institutional factors leading to delivery of services, and then this whole business of whether public service can be privatized or is there a role for the government at the end of the day. These are the range of issues that thanks to Vikram we've been able to canvas, and it is now for you, each one of you, to make a learning experience of what you heard today and what you read. And what I would do if I were you, and I have benefited immensely, is go home or wherever and reflect on what you heard today and write up a small one-page journal on it as to what did Vikram say, what was the discussion about, and what are the learnings for me from this session. Believe me, if you do that, you will really find this to be a very productive experience. So on your behalf and on behalf of St. Joseph's College and B.PAC, I'd like to thank Dr. Vikram Chand for joining us today and for giving us such a stimulating session. I think we owe him I'd like to thank St. Joseph's College for providing a forum like this to B.PAC. I'm looking forward to greater cooperation between B.PAC and the St. Joseph's College. And thank you very much. And over now to the college authorities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. This was indeed a very informative and interesting discussion. It has truly given us a new perspective on public service delivery. A citizen-centric delivery system is much crucial for the inclusive growth of our nation. is what I'd say right now. Before I move on, I would like to give a brief introduction about our co-collaborator today, the Bangalore Political Action Committee, B.PAC. B.PAC is a non-partisan citizen group that aims to improve the government in Bangalore and enhance the quality of life of every Bangalorean. B.PAC specific targets the good governance and practices as well as supporting and identifying the strong candidates in the public office at all levels. Ultimately, they aim to create a safer city where the rule of law is ensured for all its residents. To know more about B.PAC and what they do, please do follow them on their social media sites, bpac.official. And to know more events and internships offered, please do visit their online site, bpac.in. Thank you. Now, I'd like to call upon Zoe Liz Phillip, the Editor-in-Chief of the Economic Gazette, to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. It is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks and acknowledge those whose contributions have made this event a success. On behalf of the Economics Forum, Department of Economics, St. Joseph's College, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Vikram K Chand, and the moderator, Mr. K Jairaj, who took the time to visit us at our campus and speak to our students, and to deliver such a thought-provoking conversation today. On behalf of my fellow office bearers, I extend my sincere regards to the Principal, Rector and Registrar of St. Joseph's College, Mr. Clement D'Souza, Dean of the School of Humanities, Miss Anita Nerona, Head of Department of Economics, Mr. Keshav Murthy, Coordinator of the Economics Forum, Ms. Tracy Joy, Coordinator of Economica. I would like to thank the Bangalore Political Action Committee for collaborating with our forum to make this event possible. I thank the core committee members of the Economics Forum. A big thank you to the volunteers who work behind the scenes to execute this event so efficiently. Thank you to our participants in the audience for being kind, cooperative and engaging. We have come to a close for today's event. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.